Hello everyone, I'm going to make a very brief video this time about second language acquisition theory. So it may seem that we are talking about theories nonstop for a month now. However, and this is the most important thing, this module, like this equator module in the middle of the course, is truly helping us transition from theory to instructional decisions. So we have covered how first language acquisition is explained. We have covered what's happening when people are learning a second language and what factors are impacting them. We also talked about the individual differences and how we can't really control them. Today, we are going to put it all together into what we know about second language acquisition, like what are those theories that inform our practice. And we will also transition into practice this week. This is why, as your assignment, you have two chapters to read. Chapter 4, that focuses on second language acquisition theories, and chapter 5, that talks about some of it may not be very applicable, but it does talk about observing the classroom, how the settings may be different, and how the setting impacts the language acquisition process, and also the instructional decisions, the instructional design that truly impacts how learners are acquiring language and the rate at which they can acquire it. Okay, so let's move on. Right. So I want you, and one thing I want you to know is it may seem that we don't need to know all these theories as teachers. However, and this is my goal for this module, to show you that knowledge of theories is truly a lens that helps us process and interpret the patterns that we see in the field, that the patterns we see of why some learners are learning faster and why others are not learning. And it also informs us at how we can adjust our instruction and our choices, our interaction, our corrective feedback, and our questioning to help learners grow. So, one thing before we delve into second language acquisition is I want you to be mindful that second language acquisition is slightly different from first language acquisition, and it is also slightly different from content area learning because it is in the intersection of education, psychology, and linguistics. It is truly learning a second language is a very multifaceted phenomenon. I like to think of it as driving a car. When you are driving a car, even though like everybody's driving with the automatic gear, and there was the time when people were learning to drive with the manual shift. However, when you are driving, there are so many things you need to keep in mind. You need to watch the road, you need to watch the signs. You also need to be aware of what's happening behind you. Like, this is why you have the rear view mirror. You need to be aware of what's happening to the right and to the left, how you interpret the road, like the traditional exercise in all driving courses that if you see a bike on the lawn, watch out, the kids may jump on the road. So, learning a language and speaking a language is very much like driving. There are so many things involved. Your hands need to be on the steering wheel, your eyes need to monitor the environment to the right, to the left, in front of you, behind you. Your legs need to be either on the paddle or close to the paddle so you could brake at the time that uh, it comes to brake. It is a very complex skill. So, this is why learning or understanding second language acquisition involves knowledge of linguistics. So, what are the rules of the language that need to be acquired? So, what is the grammar? What is the phoneme? What are those fancy things you learned in prior courses? It also involves the knowledge of education, how we can create an environment that would foster the acquisition of those complex linguistic phenomena. How can we build on the educational theories that can help us design our instruction the best way possible? And we also need to include the knowledge of psychology. And this is what we were doing last week when we were talking about motivation and identity, and also affective filter like anxiety, willingness to communicate. So, second language acquisition is truly at the intersection of three very broad disciplines. Also, the factors that impact learning are learning factors, the ones that we've discussed, those fancy theories that were tried that are very interconnected. Remember that all of those identity and personality and motivation and learning style, they're very closely knit. Like you pull one thread and here comes another bundle of truly very hard to separate concepts. But also it's the context. This is what chapter 5 introduces you to. Is this a natural context? So natural settings. Do the students have an opportunity to practice language at home? Are they learning on the playground? How much of interaction do they have in the second language? Or is it truly just an English as a foreign language setting, like very structure based? It may or may not be communicative based learning, but it could be very limited. Like all across the world, pretty much everybody's learning English, if not as a second language or not as a new language, but as a foreign language. And the settings would be different. Like students in Russia learn English 3 times a week, 45 minutes, not even every day, 3 times a week. Some schools may have 2 times a week, and it may vary. Um, those things do have an impact. I know it may not have an impact on for us working in the United States and the state of New York. However, you need to be aware of those contexts. And also, is there input, interaction, or modified interaction available? How are the sessions structured? This is why I always encourage you to ask each other that kindergarten learning and kindergarten content area learning is very different from high school. So if recasts and scaffolding in the interaction is available at kindergarten, it may not be that easily available at high school when the periods are 48 minutes long and the lessons are structured very much lecture based, or it could be project based learning. How does the teacher reach all the groups and provide feedback and scaffold interaction for all the groups? So, those could be some peculiarities that we just need to keep in mind. And also the instruction, like, is it focusing only on interpersonal communicative competence skills? Or is it focusing on academic language? Is it focused on form, function, or any combination thereof? Like those things also need to be kept in mind. Okay. Second language acquisition, magnifying glass. Again, I'm trying to instill this idea into you that you don't need to take sides in this module, like who you agree with, who you disagree with. You need to understand that some theories have a limited explanatory power. Yes, all of them explain one of the facets of second language acquisition. However, some of them fall short more than others. One important thing to know is also that if you look at them in a chronological order, they tend to build upon each other. This is why it's nice to know them, because who knows, maybe you would like to build your own theory and propose your own theoretical framework to explain second language acquisition. And in order to propose something new, you need to know what came before you. So it is the magnifying glass. It does offer us a lens through which we can interpret the patterns we see in the classroom. Without further ado, let's take a look at some benefits and downsides of those theories. So the behaviorist theory, yes, it is the same behaviorist theory we covered in first module. So it explains why repetition matters. However, it doesn't explain why learners create new forms. Remember, it's habit formation. And even for second language acquisition, it has very limited potential why, explaining why, or the process to which first language habits can actually interfere with second language habits. So this is why if we follow the same pattern repetition, repeat the words, say after me, not really helpful. This is why I put in a video how Joey learns French, that it may not be as helpful. Okay, Inatist approach. Remember that was Noam Chomsky with his universal grammar, claiming that we as people like can have all the prerequisites to learn a language. Like we're wired to learn a language. So Krashen built on this idea. Like what he modified, suggested is the comprehensible input hypothesis. I'm sure you have heard about comprehensible input, and I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. However, he was claiming that comprehensible input is enough to learn a language. Like make the input comprehensible and you're good. They'll learn. He was very criticized for this idea because it can't really be tested, not very testable, and also there's a couple other limitations. But also, he doesn't explain why accuracy often stalls. So even if there is comprehensible input, left and right, why are some students still not accurate and making mistakes? No explanation. That's a limitation. Interactionist approach formulate and truly argue that engagement is the core of language learning, but they cannot explain why some forms don't develop without attention. So yes, interaction, but at the same time, some things are just develop developmentally. And cognitive approach, again, very highly regarded. The information processing theory is very highly regarded and taken up in content area in content area learning, like when it comes to math and when it comes to science and when it comes to social studies. Um, we need to chunk information. Our brain is a processing machine. We need to chunk it, we need to sequence. Cognitive overload is a real thing. We cannot process too much at the same time. And it does explain cognitive limits, but it doesn't say much about the emotion, identity, and power. So, all of these theories have their drawbacks, their limitations. However, they do progress and they do explain of what is going on in language learning. So, let's take a look at this slide. And this is truly how it was developing. So, the comprehensible input, that was Krashen's hypothesis, formulated one of his hypotheses within his monitor model. Was formulated in early 1980s. Like it's 1982, the monitor model, but then it was published in 1985, and there are many videos on YouTube Krashen actually explaining that comprehensible input is key for language learning and for content area language learning. When he speaks German without pointing, and then he points and explains that this is on Kopf, Auge, Ohren, and all the other things. I'm sure you can find that video and enjoy it. What was taken up by The Contemporary by Meryl Swain at the same year. Like she was criticizing him for too much focus on the input. And she said that it's not the input, it's the output. The comprehensible output is what drives language learning. So people or learners learn language only when they produce either oral or written language. That was a very important um, modification of the hypothesis. And finally, Michael Long took it a step further, saying that truly we need to shift our emphasis from input or output to interaction, because it's only in the interaction that meaning can be negotiated. And negotiation of meaning is one of those key terms that is used in this chapter. That this is the discussion that the speakers make when the communication is broken and the interlocutors try to negotiate meaning. So they find other ways to verbalize the idea, or they're using gestures to support the interaction. This is what negotiation of meaning is. But he also suggested that there is a noticing hypothesis, that noticing is super important for language learning, and it is happening in the zone of proximal development. Um, let's talk about that as well in a few seconds. So now if you think about those three theories, like behaviorist, innatist, and interactionist, while for first language acquisition, they were only talking about behaviorists, were talking about imitation and practice. For second language learning, they were also talking about practice and memorization. Like the shift is slightly different. Like it's still there on practice. We need to practice and form the habit, but we need to memorize, like very heavy emphasis on memory. The innatist approach, the Chomsky was suggesting, like we're wired, we need minimal input, and then we'll take it up. Krashen modified it, saying, no, 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 no. It's not the minimal input. It has to be comprehensible. If we cannot understand what we're learning or what we're being said, there is no way we can make any connections in our brain. So you can spend 8 hours a day listening to Chinese operas or music. The likelihood that you will learn them if you're just listening on the radio is close to zero, that you will take up any Chinese. So this is where the interactionist approach came handy, that it's interaction, child-directed speech. However, for second language acquisition, it's not only child-directed, but it's also modified. And modified meaning that it's a modified interaction. We're modifying the input, and also we are offering alternative ways for students to demonstrate the learning, and also alternative ways for them to have their output. For example, and gets me to the corrective feedback section. So this is in chapter 5. I know this is just 2 or 3 pages and they may be overlooked, but I don't want you to overlook them. I really want you to read them thoroughly about the studies on corrective feedback. So one thing, I'll start from the backwards. So the question, do you understand, does not really helping you check for comprehension. Because yes, I understand, but you don't know. This is why when I say that we need to offer alternative ways for students to demonstrate their knowledge, or alternative ways to have comprehensible output, that could be show me what you understand, or point. So this is how we're checking for comprehension, but also this is the feedback we want to give students. And this is like, it ties to the questions, but it's also making us aware that even if they agree, it doesn't mean that they know. Some of the things that are important for us to give feedback, and the chapter talks more about it, is that in the interaction, We want students to notice either the language form or um, any linguistic concept that we want them to correct. And we're not correcting just the errors, we're correcting for development, right? It could be misunderstanding. Maybe they're using the word, um, not necessarily the grammar form, but maybe they're not using the synonyms correctly. So they may be saying that the worms live in the earth, but we want to say that, oh, the earth is the planet, but they live in the soil, or they live in the ground, they live in the dirt. So English is very rich in synonyms, and this could be one of those things that we want students to understand. So in the interaction, we want them to notice it, and when it is noticed, it can be corrected. One thing that um, I saw a lot of comments in the first module about was the recasting. Yes, we're recasting for the students. We're reformulating it with the correct grammatical form. However, this is what research studies have found, that students do not always take up on recasts. So they're never sure if this is a correction or if this is a confirmation of what they just said. This is why this may be unnoticed. And if it is unnoticed, then the form will not be corrected and the language will not develop. They will continue making the same mistake or the same error. This is why the best and the most productive feedback is the one that involves the learner in interaction. Um, Questions, same thing. Some questions, they're never neutral, because questions is a powerful instructional tool. They can shape who is taking participation, how much they produce when you ask a question, who talks, and also sometimes, like, tying the pragmatic side into it. Questions can also pragmatically serve as imperatives. Would you like to start? Is not truly a question. Would you like to start is an imperative. You go first, please. Um, what studies have found is that closed questions produce short accuracy focused responses, and open questions or genuine questions are more likely to have students produce longer complex language and create more opportunities for interaction. And if there is more opportunity for interaction, it means that there is more opportunity for you to prompt, there's more opportunity for you to scaffold the learning, both content area learning and language learning. So please be mindful of how you're using the questions. And there are other important things mentioned in the chapter that I'm not going to retell. So the takeaway is theory leads to teacher judgment, and teacher judgment leads to better instructional decisions. Okay, I'll see you in the discussions, and enjoy the rest of your week.